For roughly 66 years, longer than most marriages, longer than most countries survive intact, a single woman's name almost never passed the Queen Mother's lips. Not in public, not in the letters historians have since combed through. She called her that woman. She attended the funeral of her own brother-in-law in June 1972, sharing St. George's Chapel with his widow, standing in the same processional out into the Windsor air, and went home having, by virtually every biographical account, not directly addressed her or acknowledged her existence. The widow was Wallis Simpson, and the woman who had perfected that refusal had been doing so since the winter of 1936. The abdication of Edward VIII is usually taught as a love story, the king who gave up everything for the woman he loved. December 11, 1936, on BBC Radio, Edward told the nation, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love." Romantic, even noble in a certain light, sacrificial. For Elizabeth Bowes Lyon, the correct genre was tragedy, and it had a specific villain. What makes the campaign remarkable, and it was a campaign, disciplined and architectural, running across 6 decades, isn't its bitterness. It's its precision. Elizabeth Bowes Lyon didn't rage. She excised. She refused to grant personhood through language, withdrew recognition through institutional channels, and outlasted every person who might have offered Wallis Simpson a different story. This isn't a sister-in-law feud preserved in amber. It's the longest, most methodically sustained act of personal hostility in the recorded history of the House of Windsor. To understand what she was protecting, you have to understand what she had. Albert Frederick Arthur George was born on December 14, 1895, the second son of the Duke and Duchess of York, the future George V and Queen Mary. Within the family, he was known as Bertie, and from birth, his position in the world was defined by that word, second. His elder brother Edward was the heir. Albert was the spare. He wasn't suited, by any conventional measure, for the life fate would eventually hand him. Sources describing his childhood use words like shy, nervous, easily frightened. His father, George V, a man of strict habits and limited warmth, reportedly hoped his second child would be a girl. Albert suffered from chronic stomach problems, knock knees, and a stammer that transformed every public speech into an ordeal, for him and, by some accounts, for the listeners. After a particularly brutal public appearance at Wembley on October 31, 1925, he began working with Lionel Logue, an Australian speech therapist based in Harley Street. Logue's relationship with the king would last more than 25 years. The stammer never fully disappeared. It was managed, carefully, for the rest of his life. The Penguin Monarch series describes him plainly. He was a second son, doomed by his royal birth to occupy a secondary position. People, the same sources note, tended not to notice the shy second son. That invisibility was, in a sense, the point. Edward was the charismatic one, the Prince of Wales, the one the press followed, the one the public adored. Albert was the one who stayed at home. He met Lady Elizabeth Bowes Lyon around 1920 and became determined to marry her. She declined him twice, reportedly uncomfortable with the constraints of royal life, before accepting in January 1923. They were married at Westminster Abbey on April 26, 1923. Elizabeth knew precisely what she was marrying into: the second son, not the heir apparent. Edward VIII would eventually become king. He would presumably marry, produce an heir. Albert and Elizabeth would live out a comfortable, relatively sheltered existence as the Duke and Duchess of York. They did exactly that, settling eventually at Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, raising 2 daughters, Elizabeth, born 1926, and Margaret, born 1930. Living what one source describes as a relatively sheltered life. In the early 1930s, there was every structural reason to believe this life was permanent. Edward, as Prince of Wales and then as king from January 1936, would reign. He would eventually produce a successor. Albert would remain in the background. The arrangement suited him. The documentary record suggests it suited Elizabeth, too. Then Edward met Wallis Simpson. The Instrument of Abdication was signed at Fort Belvedere, Surrey, on December 10, 1936. Edward signed it in the presence of his three surviving brothers, Albert, Henry, and George. The actual legal effect of the abdication came on December 11th, when Parliament passed the Abdication Act. Edward broadcast to the nation that evening. Albert acceded to the throne as George VI. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the woman who had twice declined to become a royal wife because she feared losing her freedom, became Queen of the United Kingdom. The day before the abdication took effect, Albert went to London to see his mother. His diary entry that night is one of the most revealing primary sources in the entire story. When I told her what had happened, I broke down. Queen Mary's own recollection, as recorded decades later by biographer Sally Bedell Smith, was that her son sobbed on my shoulder for a whole hour, there upon that sofa. She called it a dreadful moment. Elizabeth's recorded reaction at the time was cooler in tone, but no less telling. Writing to Queen Mary during the crisis, she expressed confidence in her husband. "I have great faith in Bertie. He sees very straight." But in a letter that a 2009 Guardian review of William Shawcross's authorized biography identified as written at the height of the abdication crisis, Elizabeth expressed herself more directly about Wallis Simpson's position. "If Mrs. Simpson isn't fit to be queen, she isn't fit to be the king's morganatic wife." That sentence is significant. It isn't the language of someone who found the situation merely awkward or constitutionally inconvenient. It's a verdict. The broader royal family was similarly unforgiving. One historical analysis summarizes the mood bluntly. The royal family as a whole was bitter about Edward's behavior and convinced that Mrs. Simpson was responsible, and they refused to receive Wallis Simpson socially. No senior British royal attended Edward and Wallis's wedding at the Château de Condé in France on June 3, 1937. Not one. The deliberate snub was, in this sense, institutional, shared by George VI, Queen Mary, and Elizabeth herself. But Queen Mary's hostility, real as it was, died with her in 1953. George VI died with him in 1952. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's lasted until 2002. That is the number that matters. Not 1936, not 1 year of anger or 5 or 10. 66 years, approximately, from the signing of the abdication instrument to her death in the spring of 2002. The precise span from December 1936 to March 2002 is closer to 65 years and 3 months, but the shape of it's the same. A lifetime. An entire sustained human lifetime of disciplined hostility. For context, the United States has existed as an independent nation for fewer years than the Queen Mother maintained her position on Wallis Simpson. What drove it to that length, and that intensity, was something that happened on February 6, 1952. George VI's health began to fracture visibly in the final years of his reign. He was a heavy smoker his entire adult life. Around 1948, doctors diagnosed arteriosclerosis, a hardening and narrowing of the arteries, affecting his legs, causing pain serious enough to generate real concern about potential gangrene. In March 1949, he underwent a right lumbar sympathectomy to treat arterial blockage. That operation bought time. It didn't solve the underlying problem. In May 1951, a shadow was detected on his left lung during a chest X-ray. The structure had changed. In September of that year, the implications became unavoidable. On September 23, 1951, George VI underwent a left total pneumonectomy, the complete removal of his left lung, performed by Sir Clement Price Thomas at Buckingham Palace, in a room specially prepared for the procedure. The changing of the guard was moved to St. James's Palace to reduce external noise. Emergency lighting was installed. Public bulletins used the phrase, Structural abnormalities. The true diagnosis, lung cancer, was withheld from the public. It was also, reportedly, withheld from the king himself. He was told he had a blocked bronchus. He recovered sufficiently to see his daughter Elizabeth off on a Commonwealth tour. She was in Kenya when a message reached her. Her father had been found dead in his bed at Sandringham House at approximately 7:30 in the morning of February 6, 1952. The official cause of death was coronary thrombosis, a blood clot. He was 56 years old. Official cause: a clot, not the cancer, not the missing lung. The medical record is precise on this point. But it's also true that a 56-year-old man who had spent the previous 16 years leading a nation through the Second World War, managing the dissolution of an empire, and doing so with one lung removed 4 months before his death, wasn't a man whose body had been treated gently by the role that had been thrust upon him in December 1936. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, now the Queen Mother at the age of 51, drew a straight line between those two facts. She connected December 1936 and February 1952, and she connected them through one name she wouldn't say out loud. The BBC would later report, carefully, that the Queen Mother is also said to have blamed the Windsors for her husband's early death in 1952. Biographer Ingrid Seward went further, characterizing Elizabeth's attitude toward the Windsors as something that bordered on a vendetta. One scholarly source puts it with a clarifying parenthetical. She held Wallis Simpson at least partly responsible for George VI's premature death, even though he died of lung cancer. No source provides the exact private words in which Elizabeth articulated this conviction. She was, as her authorized biographer William Shawcross noted, someone who generally avoided recording family controversies in her later papers. The causal verdict, "Wallis sent my husband to an early grave," is attributed through secondary sources, biographers, and reported conversations, rather than a single dated document. What isn't in doubt is that the conviction organized everything that followed. Every refusal, every silence, every institutional decision over the next 50 years is best understood as the steady expression of that private judgment. What she called her was the first and most visible expression of it. Anne Seba's biography of Wallis Simpson, published in 2011, is titled simply, "That Woman." The title isn't Seba's invention. As Seba herself explains in promotional material, and as the National Archives confirmed in a 2026 event description, "That Woman" was the Queen Mother's habitual designation for Wallis Simpson, and it was shared by other members of the royal family. It became, over years, her signature way of referring to a person she had apparently decided didn't merit a proper name. The function of that phrase is worth examining. Naming is a form of acknowledgement. To call someone by their name, even to say it bitterly, is to grant them an existence in your world. That Woman refuses that. It gestures at a presence while declining to admit one. After everything that happened, after her husband's tears, after his death at 56, after 16 years of war and strain that she blamed on an act of romantic selfishness in December 1936, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon apparently decided that the woman responsible for all of it didn't deserve the dignity of a name. The phrase is well attested across multiple biographers. What isn't well attested, and the documentary record makes this important, is the absolute claim that she never spoke Wallis's name across 6 decades. One of her closest associates, the Duke of Grafton, said of her, "She never said anything nasty about the Duchess of Windsor, except to say she really hadn't got a clue what she was dealing with." That sentence uses Wallis's formal title. It's also, notably, the single most revealing thing any close associate said about Elizabeth's private manner on the subject. not rage, not Gothic contempt, but the considered opinion of a woman who had assessed her rival and found her inadequate for the disaster she'd caused. She hadn't got a clue what she was dealing with, meaning Bertie, the monarchy, the weight of it, the cost. The institutional dimension of the campaign moved in parallel with the personal one. On May 27, 1937, George VI issued letters patent establishing the Dukedom of Windsor and confirming Edward's style as Royal Highness. The same instrument explicitly stated that his wife and descendants, if any, shall not hold said title or attribute. Wallis Simpson would be the Duchess of Windsor, always a duchess, never a Royal Highness. This broke with settled royal protocol. Under normal precedent, a woman who lawfully marries a Royal Highness becomes one herself. There was no precedent for excluding a duchess from her husband's style in this way. The letters patent created new territory specifically to deny Wallis Simpson a status that protocol would otherwise have given her automatically. The formal decision was George VI to make, and it was formally his. But the Wikipedia entry on Wallis Simpson, citing multiple biographical sources, states that George VI's firm view that the Duchess shouldn't be given a royal title was shared by his mother, Queen Mary, and his wife, Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother. Biographer Ingrid Seward specifically records Elizabeth as having backed her husband's refusal to allow Simpson to take the title Her Royal Highness. The HRH denial wasn't a unilateral act by one woman. It was a consensus within the royal family, but it was a consensus she actively shaped and strongly supported. The effect was both symbolic and concrete. For the remaining 35 years of their marriage, Edward and Wallis attended official functions and social occasions where the correct form of address for the Duke was Your Royal Highness, and for his wife was Your Grace. Every time someone curtsied to Edward and didn't curtsy to Wallis, the letters patent of May 1937 were operating exactly as intended. The Duke never fully accepted it. He reportedly insisted that people in his presence address his wife as Your Royal Highness, regardless. Those who did so in Britain were, in effect, defying palace protocol. Seward records that when Edward was appointed governor of the Bahamas in 1940, an appointment widely interpreted at the time as a polite mechanism for keeping the couple out of Britain during wartime, Elizabeth had reportedly already sent telegrams to officials in Nassau instructing them not to bow or call Wallis Your Royal Highness. This account comes from a single source and can't be independently verified with the sources available. But if accurate, it's the most direct evidence of personal institutional intervention. Not the palace acting on its own judgment, but Elizabeth specifically, reaching into the administration of a colonial post to ensure the protocol held in a place the couple had been effectively exiled to. Edward would serve as governor of the Bahamas until 1942. The couple then lived primarily in France, spending time between their Paris house and a house in the Bois de Boulogne. Edward came back to Britain occasionally, for medical appointments, for royal occasions, very rarely for family events. He came, by multiple accounts, without ever being genuinely welcomed back. The family remained, in Seward's word, closed. No senior member of the royal family attended the Duke and Duchess's Paris home with any regularity. Contact was managed through officials. Formal communications with the Duke were often conducted through intermediaries rather than direct family correspondence. The wedding had been snubbed. The title had been denied. The BBC notes that the Queen Mother finally met the ex-king and the Duchess in 1966, implying that before that year, the separation was effectively total, at least from her side. Almost 30 years after the abdication, the most documented single act of institutional exclusion, beyond the HRH denial, is simply the failure of anyone from the British royal family to attend the Windsor wedding in June 1937. Not a protest, not a public statement, not a dramatic confrontation, just an absence. That absence was the template for what followed. Edward VIII died on May 28, 1972, at his home at 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement in Paris. He was 77 years old. He had been a heavy smoker and died of throat cancer. His body was flown back to Britain and lay in state at Windsor Castle for 3 days. The funeral service was held on June 5, 1972, at St. George's Chapel. Wallis Simpson came to England for it. She stayed at Buckingham Palace during her visit. The invitation was Queen Elizabeth II's, and it represented one of the very few moments in the 36 years since the abdication where any formal gesture of welcome had been extended. A photograph from June 2nd shows her arriving at Buckingham Palace as her husband lay in state at Windsor. She was, by that point, already showing the signs of the cognitive decline that would eventually consume her final years. She suffered from arteriosclerosis causing mental confusion. She was frightened. According to Hugo Vickers's biography, Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, cited in the Wikipedia entry on the Duke of Windsor's funeral, Wallis was nervous about meeting Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, who had a long-held antipathy toward her due to the strain that Edward's abdication had had on her husband, George VI. Lord Mountbatten reportedly reassured her, "Your sister-in-law will receive you with open arms. She is deeply sorry for you in your present grief and remembers what it was like when her husband died." The funeral service itself lasted 30 minutes. Wallis sat next to Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip during the service. The Queen Mother was also present. Following the service, a contemporaneous photograph from Getty Images captures the procession leaving St. George's Chapel. Queen Elizabeth II, followed by the Duchess of Windsor, followed by the Queen Mother. In the same outdoor air, in the same processional, within feet of each other, for the first time in perhaps a decade, certainly in the first genuine shared occasion in years. One journalist, Michael Thornton, who claimed personal knowledge of both women, stated that the Queen Mother spoke briefly to Wallis at the funeral and kissed her cheek. This account is single source and unverified by other biographical material. What Thornton's account also records, and this is the part that lands regardless of whether the kiss happened, is that Wallis described the decades of exclusion to her close associates as having been driven by jealousy of me for having married him. Whether or not that was psychologically accurate, it's the other woman's theory of the campaign. It says something that she believed it was about the man, not about Bertie. What is documented, carefully in the source record, Wallis attended the funeral. The Queen Mother attended the funeral. They shared the same space. They were captured in the same processional frame. The Wikipedia entry on the Duke's funeral notes that Elizabeth met Wallis only once during her stay, on the day of the funeral. That Elizabeth refers to Queen Elizabeth II, not the Queen Mother. The distinction matters. The degree to which the Queen Mother and Wallis Simpson interacted directly on that day isn't definitively settled in the available sources. What is settled is the broader shape of the occasion. A man they had both loved, in their entirely different ways, was buried at the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore. Wallis flew directly back to Paris following the ceremony, accompanied by John Utter, the Duke's private secretary, who had traveled to England with her. She didn't stay. She had no reason to. The exclusion Wallis Simpson lived with wasn't invisible to her, and it wasn't merely psychological. Her husband spent the last decades of his life in a limbo of imprecise status, funded in part by an annual Crown allowance reported to be £25,000, living in France, welcome in smart French and American social circles, regarded by the British establishment as a problem that had been safely stored abroad. The HRH denial followed Wallis everywhere. Flowers, seating arrangements, forms of address. No HRH prefix, even in death. The letters patent of May 1937 were still operating, on a casket, 49 years later. The Guardian's contemporaneous coverage of Wallis's death, from April 25, 1986, contains a detail that functions almost as an accidental summary of everything. Her death yesterday came 2 months short of her 90th birthday, and only 8 months before the 50th anniversary of King Edward VIII's abdication to marry her. She died without a period ending the story. The abdication's anniversary was still coming. Wallis Simpson died on April 24, 1986, at her home at 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement in Paris, the same address where Edward had died 14 years earlier from bronchial pneumonia. She was 89. Her final years were a catalogue of loss. Arteriosclerosis had caused cognitive decline as early as 1972. By 1975, dementia had settled in seriously. By 1980, she had lost her ability to speak. Her fingers became so arthritic that they could no longer hold her wedding ring. She was confined to bed, receiving only medical staff, playing Cole Porter records from the 1930s in an attempt to maintain some thread of memory. The Guardian quoted her close friend, Lady Diana Moseley, on the day of Wallis's death. "It wasn't really a life at all. I'm delighted to hear she has died. I wish she'd died many years ago." Wallis was buried on April 29, 1986, at the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore, beside Edward. The funeral service was held at St. George's Chapel and lasted 28 minutes. 175 mourners were present. Per Wallis's own wishes, there was no funeral address, no eulogies, no direct references to her life made during the ceremony. Only once, in a prayer, did a canon of Westminster refer to her as "our sister." The Queen Mother attended the chapel service. That detail isn't a small one. The Queen Mother attended Wallis Simpson's funeral. She sat through a 28-minute service. Then she didn't walk to the grave. The historical record on the question of the Queen Mother's specific role in shaping the decades of exclusion requires a note of care. The HRH denial was formally George VI's sovereign act. The decision to exclude the couple from royal social life was a shared position within the family, supported also by Queen Mary, the government, and the Dominion Prime Ministers who unanimously backed the letter's patent. The Nassau telegrams are attributed to Elizabeth by a single biographer. The patterns of social exclusion are described in general terms across multiple sources, but rarely with specific attributed incidents that can be traced to her direct intervention rather than the broader palace consensus. What is clear is that she was a forceful advocate within that consensus, and that she outlasted everyone else who held it. Queen Mary died in 1953. George VI died in 1952. The politicians and advisors of 1936 were long dead. Queen Elizabeth II, over time, made gestures toward the Windsors that went beyond what her mother would have countenanced. The 1966 meeting, the Buckingham Palace hospitality in 1972, the quiet post-funeral burial beside Edward. The exclusion never fully broke, but under the next generation's management, it softened at the edges. Under the Queen Mother's own management, it didn't. William Shawcross, whose authorized biography of the Queen Mother was written with access to her personal papers, is described in reviews as treating Wallis as the Queen Mother's nemesis, while approaching her animosity relatively gently, pulling, as one critic noted, his punches. Even the official version, filtered through a sympathetic biographer with full access to the archive, arrives with the impression of something controlled, self-managed, deliberately not put into writing. That discipline is, in its own way, the most revealing thing. She understood that documentation was power. She understood that if you never say the name, no one can quote you saying it. The campaign's architecture was partly built from the absence of evidence. No diatribes, no confrontations, no scenes. Just the consistent, decades-long withdrawal of acknowledgement from a woman she had decided, privately and permanently, was responsible for her husband's death. One close associate who knew the Queen Mother well recorded a different kind of assessment. The Duke of Grafton's testimony, "She never said anything nasty about the Duchess of Windsor, except to say she really hadn't got a clue what she was dealing with," is the most honest summary of the Queen Mother's private verdict that the record provides. Not Gothic contempt, not obsessive hatred, a considered judgment. That woman didn't understand what she was doing, and it cost my husband his life. There is a version of this story, the popular version, the one Edward himself helped create on that December evening in 1936, in which the abdication is a triumph of love over duty. A man choosing a woman over an empire. Romantic to the point of tragedy, but romantic nonetheless. That narrative has had extraordinary cultural staying power. It's the frame that Edward locked into place with his broadcast. It's the frame the National Archives itself deployed in a 2026 event titled Wallis and Edward, the Greatest Love Story of the 20th Century. Hugo Vickers, biographer of both the Queen Mother and the Duchess, has argued in recent years that Wallis herself didn't want the abdication, that she enjoyed being the king's friend, but in no way did she want to become his wife or to cause a major constitutional crisis. In this reading, she is as much a victim of Edward's intransigence as anyone else. For Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, none of these framings mattered. The abdication wasn't a love story. It was the night a man she had known as shy, second, unsuited for the weight of history, suddenly became responsible for carrying it, and the night she understood, clearly, that he might not survive it. George V had reportedly said about his eldest son, "After I am dead, that boy will ruin himself in 12 months." He was approximately right. But the ruin he was predicting was Edward's. Nobody predicted that the ruin would land on Bertie. Albert Frederick Arthur George, born fourth in line to the throne, the child whose birthday fell on the anniversary of Prince Albert's death, the stammering second son whom people tended not to notice, reigned as George VI for 16 years. He led Britain through the Second World War. He gave speeches on the radio that his speech therapist had helped him prepare line by painful line. He accepted the dissolution of an empire. He died at 56, 4.5 months after having a lung surgically removed, never having been told he had cancer. The Queen Mother, in her private accounting, laid this at Wallis Simpson's feet. Not entirely. She wasn't irrational, and the BBC's phrasing is careful. She held Wallis at least partly responsible, but substantially. The abdication put Bertie on the throne. The throne broke his health. The health gave out at 56. The chain, as she constructed it, ran from Baltimore to Sandringham. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon outlived her husband by 50 years. She outlived Wallis Simpson by 16 years. She died at Royal Lodge, Windsor Great Park, on March 30, 2002, at 3:15 in the afternoon, with her daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, at her side. She was 101 years old. Her coffin was brought to London and lay in state at Westminster Hall. An estimated 200,000 members of the public filed past. The queue stretched over a mile along the River Thames and across Lambeth Bridge. On the morning of her funeral, April 9, 2002, the tenor bell of Westminster Abbey rang 101 times, one for each year she had lived. Britain mourned her as, in the popular phrase, the nation's grandmother, the woman who had stayed in London during the Blitz, who had visited bomb sites and munitions factories, who had been called the most dangerous woman in Europe by Adolf Hitler because of her popularity. She had outlasted the abdication crisis, both world wars, the dissolution of the British Empire, every prime minister from Neville Chamberlain to Tony Blair, and every person from 1936 who might have offered Wallis Simpson a different version of events. Wallis had already been dead for 16 years by then. She had died in Paris on April 24, 1986, in the house her husband had built for their exile, attended by her doctor and nurses. No family, no children, the couple had none. Her funeral, at St. George's Chapel, lasted 28 minutes. No prefix, no Royal Highness. The letters patent of 1937, the ones Elizabeth had backed so strongly, were on her coffin. Wallis was buried at Frogmore beside Edward. Both their graves are in the Royal Burial Ground, within sight of Windsor Castle, marked with simple stones. The man who gave up a throne to marry her rests a few feet from the woman who went home from his funeral without speaking to his widow. The question the evidence raises, and that the evidence can't quite close, is one of motive. The Queen Mother's campaign against Wallis Simpson is documented. The "that woman" designation is attested by multiple biographers, derived from regular usage across decades. The HRH denial is legally documented in letters patent. The social exclusion is confirmed by the 30-year gap before any royal meeting. The absence from the Windsor wedding in 1937 is confirmed. The attributed Nassau telegrams suggest direct intervention, if Seward's account is accurate. The pattern is real, and it ran from 1936 to 2002. What isn't easily disentangled is whether this was grief expressed as policy or policy expressed as grief. Elizabeth Bowes Lyon lost a man she loved at 51. She had watched that man weep on his mother's shoulder in December 1936, watched him smoke himself through a war, watched him die in his sleep at Sandringham. The verdict she assigned, that this was Wallis Simpson's fault, may have been wrong by any medical or causal standard. Lung cancer and coronary thrombosis aren't caused by being forced onto a throne. The strain of kingship accelerated the decay, perhaps, but it was the cigarettes. None of that matters, finally, to the question of how a human being in grief assigns cause. Elizabeth assigned cause. She assigned it in December 1936, and she never revised the assignment. She had 66 years to revise it. She didn't. Was it discipline or bitterness? Was it a widow's justice or a widow's obsession? The two things aren't mutually exclusive. The Queen Mother may have been entirely right to identify the abdication as the structural cause of her husband's accelerated death, and the woman who made the abdication necessary as the person to hold accountable for it, even if the specific medical chain was more complicated than she believed. She may also have been someone who, in the simplest human way, needed a name to put on her loss. That woman served both purposes at once. What is documented is the outcome. Wallis Simpson never achieved any meaningful rehabilitation into British royal life during the Queen Mother's lifetime. She died abroad, in exile, attended by paid staff, without the title she had wanted, without the recognition she thought she was owed, buried in England, but never truly accepted there. The Queen Mother died at Royal Lodge, the home she loved, with her daughter at her side, mourned by a nation that knew her as its grandmother. She went to her grave having spent roughly 66 years declining to say a woman's name. That is either the most disciplined grief in the history of the modern monarchy or the most disciplined revenge. After 66 years, the line between them had long since disappeared. If you want more stories told this way, properly sourced, without the sentimentality, subscribe. New videos every week.